high-quality prairies. A lot of you are Academy members and friends, and for those of you who are not familiar with us, I'm going to take just a couple moments to tell you a little bit about who we are and to mention a couple additional upcoming public science seminars that you might have an interest in attending. The Academy is a local nonprofit. We've been serving the St. Louis community for a very long time, since 1856, and we have a long-standing mission to advance the public understanding of science and inspire the next generation of scientists and science advocates. We do that through a broad range of free and low-cost public science programs, collaborative seminar series, and trips and tours that highlight science at venues throughout the region. You can find more information on us by visiting our website at academyofsciencestl.org. You may also visit us on Facebook or Twitter, or you can pick up some of the literature that I brought along with me here today and left outside at the visitor's desk. It probably wasn't here when you got here this evening, but it is out there now, so feel free to pick any of that up before you leave tonight. If you'd like to receive e-notification of upcoming Academy and St. Louis Zoo public lectures and events, there will be some e-news sign-up sheets that will make their way around the audience, and we don't share your name with any other organizations. I'm going to mention just a couple upcoming public partnership events. On Thursday evening, March 31st, that's this Thursday, Rocky Kolb, the Arthur Holly Compton Distinguished Service Professor of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the University of Chicago, speaks about the mysteries of the dark universe at Washington University's McDonald Center for the Space Sciences at 7 p.m. in Whitaker Hall, room 100. This event is free and open to the public, but you need to call 314-935-5332 for a parking permit, or you may also email trecia@physics.worcester.edu. I believe there's information on their website as well. Next, there is information on our website. I believe there's information on parking on the Washington University Physics Department website. Next Wednesday, on April 6th at 7:30 here in the Living World Auditorium is the last talk in our 2010-2011 Science Seminar Series. There are some brochures out on the visitor's desk. 2009 Academy of Science Outstanding St. Louis Scientist Innovation Award recipient and Washington University Associate Professor of Anatomy and Neurobiology, Timothy Holy, presents Squeaks and Scents, the Neurobiology of Animal Social Communication. On Friday, April 8, botanist, conservationist, and author of The Historic Countryside of the Saxon Villages, Dr. John Ackroyd, is at the Missouri Botanical Garden from 4 to 5:30 p.m. as the 2011 John Dwyer Lecturer in Biology for a book signing and talk on Saxon Transylvania, Lost World, and Botanical Paradise. Dr. Ackroyd talks about current projects that aim to conserve both the biodiversity and the European farming communities that have been maintained for more than 800 years in the species-rich countryside of the remote Saxon villages of southern Transylvania. On Wednesday, April 13th, the Academy of Science hosts its 17th Annual Outstanding St. Louis Scientist Awards Dinner in the Starlight Ballroom at the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. The dinner celebrates and recognizes the impressive scientists and engineers of St. Louis, and you can find information and ticket pricing on our website. On Saturday, April 16th, the Academy of Science leads a 6-hour baseline BioBlitz at Creve Coeur Park. The citizen science urban wildlife flash exploration and inventory of the biodiversity of the park's plant and animal life is the park's first ever BioBlitz and is open to anyone with an interest in learning more about the diversity of one of our area's treasured parks. And again, you can find more information about that on our website. There are even more April upcoming events, and again, you can find more information on these and other additional science opportunities on our website or in some of the literature that we've left for you to take with you today before you leave. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Zoo Education Director, Louise Bradshaw, and she's going to introduce the next person on the agenda.
Thank you, Rose. I think if we attended every single thing, one of those things that you mentioned, I mean, our dance cards would be really full, wouldn't they? The Academy does a wonderful job of putting on all sorts of super events and activities, lectures. I have one late breaking one to announce to you. On May 10th, Tuesday, May 10th, here at the zoo, along with the Explorers Club, the Academy, and the zoo, we're hosting Flip Nicklin, who is one of the world's foremost marine mammal biologists and photographers. He's actually a photographer at the National Geographic. And he'll be presenting Among Giants, A Life with Whales, And I have to just read one thing about Flip that I thought was fascinating. So, think of whale photos, these amazing things. His ability to free dive to depths of up to 90 feet, 27 meters, allows him to swim near enough to record whale behavior without interrupting it. I think that's pretty amazing. So I'm for sure going to be here to see him. I think that should be really fabulous. So here we have our Conservation Conversation series. We've been very lucky this year to have a lot of great speakers, and some including our speaker tonight, who's been added a little bit later to the agenda. I'm so thrilled to see so many of you here. So to introduce Paul Nelson, I'd like to call up my colleague, Jim Wilson, from the University of Missouri St. Louis and Forest Park Forever, among many other things that you do. Jim.
Thank you, Louise. And I don't have any more events to introduce tonight, so we're just right here for Paul Nelson. You like that, huh? I am really pleased to see all of you here and to be here and to have been asked to introduce Paul tonight. I've known Paul Nelson for probably 35 years. It's longer than some of my esteemed colleagues have been alive, I recognize. Paul has been involved in natural areas for at least 30 of those years in natural area management and coordination. Paul is currently with the Mark Twain National Forest as forest ecologist. I first knew him when he was fairly new from graduate school in botany at SIU, and after that with the Natural History Program of Missouri Department of Natural Resources. We served together on the Missouri Natural Areas Committee, I think. Paul's also a writer and a thinker and an illustrator, and he's illustrated, he has his own book on terrestrial natural communities of Missouri. He's illustrated about 10 other books, including The Trees of Missouri. He tells us that he illustrated his first shrub when he was 5 years old, and still has that illustration, and maybe he's going to show those things tonight, but I don't think so. I think he's here to talk about a fairly controversial management practice in prairies in Missouri, and I want you to help me welcome now Paul Nelson.
Okay, thank you. I've got to figure out how to make all the gadgets work. All right, good evening. Thank you. And I appreciate everyone having the opportunity to come out this evening to watch what I'm going to talk about and have some discussions about it. I feel at home because I am from St. Louis, even though I live in Jefferson City now and work down out of Rolla, Missouri. And I'm just so tickled to death to look out, seeing the audience, so many people that are friends and colleagues that I've known for a very long time. I used to go on botanical forays with the Missouri Botanical group, the Webster Groves Nature Study Society, and I was there with Jim during the initial charter formation of the the Missouri Native Plant Society. So it's very exciting to be here with an audience that I assume, for the most part, knows a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. How many people out here have been to a Missouri prairie before? Wow, that's a good starting point for me to be. So that can kind of help me in tailoring my talk a little bit to the audience. Well, I hope what I can do this evening is dive a little deeper into the soul of what a prairie is from an ecological sense. And Jim mentioned that I work for the U.S. Forest Service, so I'm here speaking as a U.S. Forest Service employee about patchburn grazing because, as Jim mentioned, I've served now on the Natural Areas Committee, and I'm still an active member on that committee for 30 years. I don't know how many other people, perhaps other than a politician, has been in some active role like that for 30 years. And so I'm a voting member of the committee. I was also instrumental in helping the Forest Service management plan. Part of that management plan now includes areas that we will be restoring ecosystems on, including glades in southwest Missouri. So I was instrumental in helping with the analysis of cattle grazing on those glades, which eventually ended in taking all the cattle off of the glades on about some 10 to 12,000 acres of those down in the southwest part of the state. So that's after about 70 years of grazing in that part of the world. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start my program. If we could bring the lights down, Ben. By the way, I want to thank Ben for helping get everything ready because he's brought this wonderful chair up here. Makes me feel a little bit more comfortable. I kind of feel like a talk show host. So I'm going to relax. And part of the reason I need to relax is because I have bad feet. And those feet have come bad over the years, as my podiatrist tells me, because I've just been too active. That's been my punishment for hiking and running marathons, bicycling, swimming, and backpacking. But nevertheless, it's been a great journey along the way, and I continue to hope to walk in the hills. So, all of you by now have deeply ingrained or entrenched in your minds what the title is, since it's been up here for the last 30 minutes. I was instrumental also in helping to introduce bison to Prairie State Park in southwest Missouri back in 1984. So I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of using patch burn grazing as a means to manage prairies. It's more of an issue of how you use the tool. But the idea back then was to attempt to try to emulate a historic disturbance process in a manner which would help to protect and preserve the biodiversity of the prairie. And so the other is these same grazing management guidelines were then published in this book that Jim has talked about on terrestrial natural communities of Missouri. And so there are a number of steps in there that you go through in order to consider the possibility of putting livestock and or bison on a native prairie. So the issue is the Department of Conservation has expanded the use of livestock on high quality prairies in the state of Missouri. And a number of people, some of you here in this group have gone out and looked at some of those prairies. I have myself, Allison Vaughn has gone, other members of the Webster Groves Nature Study Society, the Missouri Native Plant Society, and we were alarmed by the appearances initially of what the prairies looked like that were being grazed, especially high quality natural areas. So this has led to a review of using domestic livestock as a management tool. Now I must say that I'm really proud and pleased to know that very quickly, so many environmental groups or interest groups and individuals rose up because of their concerns about this particular management tool on prairies. After 30 years of being in the Natural Areas Program, people are still sensitive about what it is that we do and or what we don't do to manage some of the last and best highest quality natural areas in the state. So the issues are high quality prairie. Well, a fact is there's very little left. Number two, livestock grazing is a major destructive force for ecosystems worldwide, including Missouri's high-quality prairies. Three, patch burn grazing is a troublesome and intensive management tool, as we'll discover. Few people really understand the thresholds for recognizing damage on high-quality prairies. This is really a complex ecological challenge. And then finally, when we make mistakes, those often cause irreversible effects. So we'll go over some of those. Let's first talk about the resource. And to put it in perspective, I want you to think about the entire world and the effect that grazing has to help feed the world. And that's part of the problem. Our population worldwide continues to expand and increase. So worldwide, of all the uses that are tracked, one of those is this range and pasture, which is 26%. And that's a very large use. And let's see how it affects various different parts of biomes around the world. 1 billion acres, the size of the Amazon rainforest down in South America. We've seen how it's been characterized in terms of its diversity, giant trees, and probably one of the richest, biologically richest areas in the entire globe. If you look on Google Earth, any one of you can look on your computer if you have internet, go to Google and focus in on the Amazon rainforest, and you'll see a patchwork. And in that patchwork, when you look closely, it's going to look like this. You see virgin forest. Can all of you see that little red dot? Okay, good. And then devastation. All to burn the forest down, seed it in grasses, mostly non-natives, and then graze it. And in this part of the world, usually that grazing is most productive during the first decade or less. So cattle ranching makes up 65 to 70% of the causes for deforestation in the Amazon rain basin alone, and thus far it's an area the size of California. If we were to go to China, Gobi Desert, 1 million acres in size, and when you think about the Gobi, it's not really a desert, but it's a grassland, very short grass, but very diverse, ancient desert grassland. But grazing has expanded. This is one of the consequences. The Chinese Academy of Sciences have indicated sandstorms increased sixfold in the last 50 years. This was a 2010 sandstorm. And the bad news for the Chinese government is that the desert is growing despite their efforts to really contain it. And it's all due to the process of desertification, which has been worsened by overgrazing. Likewise, in Africa, we have the Forestry Commission administer and currently ecologist for the World Bank in Washington, D.C., looking at the causes of soil degradation in Africa. You got the same consequences. Overgrazing is threatening to impair permanently the carrying capacity of not just livestock, but the native wildlife, the native grazers that are found in that part of the world. You can go elsewhere. You can go to England or Mexico or even here in this scene in the Middle East, where so much has been decimated. They're now specialized in growing genetic stock of goats that are able to take up whatever remains. I've been in New Zealand. In New Zealand, there's 10 sheep for every person. And likewise, when I went to Waimea Canyon State Park in Kauai, I wondered, why did a place in the world so lush as Hawaii that gets 500 inches of rain a year look like a desert landscape? And on close examination, you see this covered in goats, and they're protected on the island of Kauai. So the bottom line is, worldwide, grazing is having severe negative impacts on all kinds of biomes and in a lot of vegetation and on biodiversity. 1/3 of the world's rangeland is threatened by overgrazing. Now let's focus a little more on North America. We all know during settlement that the cattle industry followed settlement. What this shows you is an outline of the tall grass prairie of the Central Plains, short, medium, tall grass, and the area of question in Missouri is about where this star is at, more or less. So when you look at the history of the patterns of open range grazing, you can look and see that there's these numerous trails that actually kind of started in Texas, and they all migrated north. If you look at the chronology, about 1820, ranching started in Texas. In 1861, the Civil War came, and people had to go fight the war. In the meantime, cattle spread throughout the Great Plains. Huge herds developed northwards through the plains. Realizing great demand, you can also see that Texans drove cattle to Sedalia, Missouri, and even Denver. In the 1885, huge herds of open range became free to anyone to use. So all of that Great Plains prairie was subject to open range. In 1890, the end of open range came with barbed wire fencing, even though open range grazing continued in Missouri up until the early 1960s. And I can remember seeing cattle on the highways in the Ozarks even up to then. So ranchers had overgrazed the plains and overstocking, which led to erosion. This is one of the consequences, and that is the Dust Bowl era. That's a huge entire swath of the western Great Plains was subject to a combination of a worn-out grazed land plus poor agricultural practices that caused the Dust Bowl to occur. What followed thereafter was, anybody know who this gentleman is? Anybody have a John Deere tractor? Well, that's who he is. In 1837, he invented this great tool. In fact, so wonderful, it's depicted as a savior for breaking the sod in the prairies, and that's what happened. And in fact, he sold thousands of these things during the first year in which he invented the steel plow that was horse-drawn. Give you an idea of the effect that steel plow has had, looking over here on the right at the Great Plains, 1850, this is how much of North America, that being in red, was near 100% agriculture, attempts to farm, no matter what the topography was like. And then 50 years later, look what happens to that Great Plains. And in fact, if you drive across the Great Plains today, you'll come to a few places where there is still prairie, like the Kansas Flint Hills. So the impact, even in North America, as looked at in assessments by the Nature Conservancy, they have compelling data that its global habitat assessments document temperate grasslands are the most endangered, least protected major habitat type on Earth, even more so than tropical systems at this point. So there's a very small amount of it. And the effect or the impact that it has on biodiversity, well, it is number one in terms of the impact, rangeland, for threatened American plant species than any other major biome in North America. All right, now we're going to take it down. We're going to focus it from the world to Missouri. And what I'm showing here is everything in this green color was the historic distribution of prairies in the state. The little red dots represent places in which we've acquired and are managing to protect prairies. It's not all of them, but it's a representation of some of those. So if we look at a prairie, and most of you said you had been to one, a prairie landscape is essentially treeless, highly diverse. We once had 15 million acres of prairie across the state at the time of European settlement. Today, and of that prairie, they're very rich. Historically, these ancient prairies had a lot of species of grasses, sedges, shrubs, and wildflowers, as many as 400 within just a small given tract of land. So if we were to look at prairie soils, I want to make the point of how ancient some of these soils are that have over millennia accrued species richness. This Dr. Ronald Amundsen, professor of economic science at the University of California, has gone out and aged some of these prairies, which include rare plants which have evolved to inhabit rare soils. This particular soil here, called the China Hat Formation, is estimated to be 4 million years old. That prairie in California, that's the estimate. If you're looking at a Missouri prairie, here's a composite drawing. No, you're not going to go to a prairie and see all these things at one time, just in one scene. But the point is, you might be fortunate in a day or two to go out and see a number of these animals that coexist in a very complex interaction of plant and animal life, both above ground and below. So what we have left of these prairies is really a reflection and directly correlated to the least disturbed of some of these remnant prairie soils that we have left. They're still intact. They haven't been damaged so severely that they've lost many of their elements. Again, Dr. Amundsen says soil diversity is tied to biological diversity. The better quality the soil, the more likely you're to have some of the ancient historic plants and animals that depend on it. If they're cultivated or in some way damaged, they're like an animal that's been domesticated. They're going to look like a facsimile of what that wild ancestor is, but there are enormous, profound changes that occur in its characteristics, and we'll go over a few of those. This slide is just meant as a depiction of the complexity of the food web of a prairie to tell you that there's a lot of complex interactions going on here in an ancient soil. When disrupted, are broken in some way. But we know we have 400 plant species that occur on the surface, but underground are thousands of different kinds of organisms that occur there. The numbers of nematodes and even bacteria in a spoonful or a teaspoon of prairie soil can be greater in that one teaspoonful than on all of the prairie that's found in one of these prairie natural areas. Unfortunately, this is what most of Missouri prairie looks like today. It used to be prairie. It's broken into a patchwork, and those prairies have, importantly for society and civilization, become sources for food and agriculture, whether it's soybeans or corn or grazing or haying. That's the primary uses in the conversion of most prairie. So out of that 15 million acres that we once had in the state of Missouri, we're down to 50,000 acres, and those are in scattered parcels or fragments. That's 99.6% destroyed. So our issue here in talking about what we're doing with patch burn grazing on native prairies is down to that last fraction of the highest quality prairies that we find in the state. Concerned organizations came along back in the 60s and 70s and recognized that most of the prairie was being destroyed and something better be done to help protect and preserve them. So came along the Missouri Prairie Foundation, which was founded in 1966, and one of its concerns, it started out with a small group of conservation professionals and volunteers that are concerned about rapid degradation and loss of grassland habitat. Today they manage about 4,000 acres. The Nature Conservancy is a key group. They manage a number of prairies. They helped, in fact, the Missouri State Park system acquire Prairie State Park along with some generous donations. 4,000 acres of bison and elk were introduced to Prairie State Park. That was one of the visions when I was working for the state park system early on. So now they've been there since 1984. So if my math is right, that's well over 25 years. So also, back in the 1970s came the Missouri Natural Area System, made up of all of these organizations, and they have to date recognized and distinguished over 180 areas of about 74,000 acres in size. Jim Henry Wilson was on that committee. I'm still on that committee. I don't know if I have any other committee members here. But anyway, that committee is still very active today in helping to preserve the very best and highest quality natural communities or ecosystems that we find in the state. And you can see on there, Mark Twain National Forest at the top. I'm a voting member on that committee. So at the time, 25, 30 years ago, Jim Henry Wilson and I were first involved in resource management and development and the evolution of natural history programs. We hired a number of people to go out and search every county for where the remnants of the highest quality ecosystems were, called Natural Features Inventory. And that inventory program still operates today. And some of these might be some very familiar names to you. One of those in particular, past employee Don Kurz, working for the Department of Conservation, was at the time instrumental. He gave me this list in acquiring every one of these prairies. And that is an amazing feat. We have to give Don a lot of credit for what he did to protect prairies in the state of Missouri. So let's look at the scorecard for what we have left. We have 485 records in the Natural Heritage Database of different locations for prairies. There are 12 distinct types of prairies in the state. Total of 45,600 areas, and they're in various degrees of quality. 378 are in private ownership, and that's kind of a scary figure. That's 25,000 acres that is subject to possibly anything happen if those prairies were to change ownership or the manager decided to do something different with them. 170 in public ownership, totaling 20,500 acres. So out of 15 million, it's down to what's owned by the public, DNR, the Department of Conservation, a few other agencies, is down to that small of a figure. 8,000 acres of that are protected in natural areas. So out of that 8,000 acres, some of that is not really the best high-quality prairie, but it's a fairly good number to start with. So some of the findings of these people who did inventories is that all remaining prairies, no matter where they're at, still show damage, primarily from grazing and maybe some other factors, but that past grazing, open range all the way until when the prairie open range was closed and then they were sectioned off with fences, past grazing has caused some damage. Monitoring, that is biologists who go out and actually do an analysis of the health of a prairie, their work is to reveal that recovering former prairie plant diversity does not readily occur under management. I'll get into that in a little bit. Prairies are thus highly susceptible to irreversible damage. If damage is done to them, they sort of go through a turnstile and you can't get back very easily. And that damage ultimately results in simplifying the prairie system, reduction in species biodiversity, loss of the system's resilience so that factors like diseases and exotic plants can invade, and or the system will entirely collapse. So if we look at the natural areas program then at the list, this is the actual list of natural areas. There are some 24 prairie natural areas. I want you to note in particular Niawathe Prairie over here. We're going to send that off to the next slide. In 1975, Niawathe Prairie became a natural area. This whole issue of what I'm talking to you tonight was probably initiated based upon what happened in Niawathe and the concerns that environmental groups have expressed about it. Niawathe was recognized then when it was acquired for rare plants such as royal catchfly, meads, milkweed, poppy mallow, this blue indigo, and even grasshopper sparrow, anyone? As well as prairie chickens. So these were some of the reasons why it was acquired, plus that rich prairie flora in the background. But what makes prairie management a challenge is different managers and the public at large all have different reasons and our needs for managing those prairies. They can either produce something or that production can be the quality of the biodiversity that's found there. One manager might say, yes, we need to protect biodiversity and do what's best to do that. Another says, well, I have a bird in mind. Someone else says, well, what about this particular insect species? And then if you're a consumer and you're a farmer living around there, you say, well, that's great hay. I can really fatten my cows, or we can hunt on it. Let's simulate grazing. And there's nature study and research. So it's a diverse ownership and always these challenging conflicting values. So what is patch burn grazing then? Okay, this this photo here is showing through a progression of seasons different areas of this large management unit, this happens to be in Oklahoma, 24,000 acres, that are burned in patches with the idea then that cattle, instead of grazing over the entire area, are attracted to the patches and will graze it most intensely. And when you get that, the main objective is to increase diversity and structure of vegetation that would benefit wildlife and maintain livestock production. Well, it was hopeful also that it would maintain the biodiversity of other organisms that are there. So when you look at this study that was conducted by Mike Leahy and Melissa Underwood in 2010, they did a multi-year study. And here's a diagram that explains, explains if you look at these arrows, they point to a succession of various different burns that occur, and you vary those burns in different parts of the prairie, and then the livestock go from one place to the next so that they're not necessarily overgrazing another part of the prairie. And the idea, again, is it provides structure for such wildlife as prairie chickens. And one of the initiatives was that we had a dire problem recognized by the Department of Conservation and others that there was a need to experiment with and adopt the use of patchburn grazing as a subset of its prairie, critical for nesting and brooding of greater prairie chickens and other obligate grassland birds, again, including grasshopper sparrow. And if you look at variable grazing intensities and durations, it was primarily looked at from the effect that this grazing would have in affecting structure in a prairie environment for different bird species. Now, granted, that's important, but I want you to think about what on a continental scale over thousands of square miles perhaps provided that same kind of habitat variation for these bird species. Now we're trying to do something on small patches that apparently operated very well on a continental scale. So we talk about bare to medium or bare to short grass structure. This is pretty bare to short. And this is what a number of people in the room, how many people have been out to Niawathe Prairie? Okay, there's a number of hands coming up here. So did you go out and see this? Yeah, most of you saw that. And I saw that too, and Alice and I saw that, and we were very concerned about it. So when you look at this in the summer of 2009, and then subsequently after the animals are taken off certain sections that are rested, you see a host of plant species that ecologists who have studied succession of plant life and/or who have actually gone out and graded the quality of prairies, assessed the health of prairies, looked at a number of plant species we call grazing increasers. I learned this in Grazing Ecology at Southern Illinois University back in 1974, a long time ago, about grazing increaser plants. And lo and behold, those are the primary plant species that you find out there on Niawathe. That alarmed Don Kurz. Don Kurz went out and talked to the manager. They had a discussion. Don didn't like the discussion. It resulted in this 45-page report. And in this report, patchburn grazing damages Missouri native prairie. Got very wide distribution pretty quick on, for example, on the internet and other coverages. This quickly resulted in a couple of articles, one of those by the Joplin Groves. Critics fear MDC practices damaging native prairies. So very quickly, this becomes volatile, and it's out there. And people are running to their defenses, pro and con. One group out of Joplin, Missouri, the Environmental Task Force is concerned about it. They write, please delay implementing this procedure at Diamond Grove Prairie, which wasn't yet on there, but it was proposed. Then other organizations quickly joined the rank and file. The Missouri Prairie Foundation, even the most ardent supporters of patchburn grazing, admit cattle grazing beyond certain levels has accounted for great irreparable damage. And so they don't feel at this time that it should be recommended or designated on natural areas or in other sites of very high floristic quality. Native Plant Society joins in, recommended treatment suspended on natural areas. St. Louis Audubon Society here in Missouri. A number of you are here tonight that were instrumental in working on this letter, which states MDC should immediately stop on high quality prairies and natural areas. I want you to note high quality. Webster Groves follows suit, strongly recommend discontinue. And then the Nature Conservancy writes a paper, management protocols designated solely from an ecological perspective, not for other reasons, particularly on high-quality natural areas, and implement at the most conservative levels and shortest duration necessary with ongoing monitoring. So let's talk about monitoring for just a second. Doug Ladd, how many of you know Doug Ladd? A lot of you. Wow, Doug's a popular guy here in St. Louis. Doug and I went to school together. So we were in fact at the same university at the same time doing research. I've known Doug 35 years. Doug worked on a program which is sort of, if you're not familiar with this coefficient of conservatism, it's kind of the doctor's way of measuring your cholesterol count. And first it's been tested in the state of Missouri and in other places in the Midwest, and now it's being widely used in the eastern half of the United States for doing assessments. So it's a way of measuring community plant health. And if your cholesterol count is 0, it's pretty bad for a plant. You don't reflect the health of an ecosystem. But if you're 10 and an excellent, then you're highly likely to be in a high quality environment. So the Nature Conservancy published the coefficients of conservative numbers for all 2,862 plants in the state of Missouri. And numbers were assigned from 0 to 10. Some of the zeros, as an example, would be this ragweed. It gets a 1, which means no matter what you do to the landscape, you can bulldoze a lot, you're probably going to get this to grow. So no threat to that species. Whereas conservative plants, these are most highly likely, you have a high level of confidence when you find a plant species like Mead's milkweed or royal catchfly that it's in a natural place, it's in a natural environment, it gets a number of 10. So numbers were assigned. This is a profile for all the numbers of the vascular plants in the state of Missouri. And you can see there's a lot of 0s to 6s, but nearly 58% of our plants are more sensitive that occur primarily still in natural systems or ecosystems. Then there's this list to the extreme right of all the exotics. They don't even get counted in this formula. 1/3 of the state's flora is now exotics, and that's very alarming. All right, so it means this old field consists of primarily 4 species. There may be a few more, but they have low numbers. So it might look pretty to somebody that's untrained. A botanist or somebody who's an amateur might say, look at all the wildflowers out there, we ought to protect this. But ecologically, this is not going to assemble itself on down the line to some high-quality ecosystem in years to come. It's just going to remain probably an old field, or it'll change, but still the species there are not reflective of quality. Whereas in a high-quality natural area, we find the plants with higher species indexes for coefficients are much higher. These are restricted to original natural communities. They're usually slow-growing, long-lived, and rather a mobile plant species, so they don't readily spread into the rest of the environment once it's been disturbed. Ecologists, these are trained botanists who have the skill of identifying, getting down on their hands and knees. I heard Justin was going to be here tonight. Justin, are you here? You didn't make it. Okay. Well, this is Doug Ladd and Justin Thomas, probably the 2 best botanists in the state of Missouri. They have the ability to go into a prairie that has 400 plant species, and even if there's a leaf in the soil, they can identify it to the species level. And that's what is needed to make sure you got this correct cholesterol counts that I'm telling you about. But what's really critical is that what they measure above ground is a reflection really truly of what's below ground. And it's that below ground portion we don't see that's extremely important in knowing what's going on with it. So all the sampling evidence that's been done looking at these health counts, the cholesterol counts for an ecosystem, high-quality prairies are overwhelmingly dominated by long-lived perennials that exhibit amazing stability from year to year. So there's a misconception that prairie plants always change. They flower at different times, you get different emphasis, you go out and they won't look the same. But the sampling shows that really it's just because you're seeing changes in the floral time or the floral timing, and our changes due to climatic response, but still the underground parts are there, they're intact. A significant decline in the quality of what's in those sampling frames is often viewed as alarming because it's probably beginning to degrade what's happening below ground. So on this scale, we can look from low quality to high quality former prairies. One of those being a prairie completely destroyed, it's an old field, city lot, yard. It has low numbers, maybe only 1.9 low index and maybe 6 species. A prairie such as one that's degraded from grazing might be medium, 2.5, or have 15 species in a sampling frame. And a high quality prairie has this index of 5.5 or greater, and maybe 23 species, very high. All right, we're going to look at Prairie State Park. How am I doing on time? Great? Okay, cool. I can talk forever. I'm glad I got a lot of time. So if we look at Prairie State Park, Southwest Missouri, established in 1979, when we took over that park and built it, it consisted of a number of fragments of land parcels in different ownership. If you look right here at these fine lines, even after 30 plus years, you can still see the remnants of fence lines. So regardless of managing that with fire over 30 years, knowing they're all degraded prairie tracts, they're still showing this evidence after 30 years of disturbance, of that past disturbance. So you can see these kind of square patterns. The Nature Conservancy came along in 1994, and they did a monitoring plan. They developed a baseline. They went in and described each one of these individual plots based upon its past history of management and the condition of vegetation. Then they set up sampling transects to look at the floristic quality. So within those sampling transects, just to simplify it, the highest quality sites have these indices that are fairly high, 4.8. These are in natural areas. The lowest quality sites that have been the most disturbed have very low numbers, 2.4 to 3.7, 2.1. What's alarming, if you look at one site which has a low number and another site, this one that has the high number, Regal Prairie was part of a natural area, and Section 17 had a history of grazing. When I first saw this, over 30 years ago, it was being heavily grazed. The alarming part of this is that after 30 years, when we started collecting and monitoring these sites, we saw that over a 15-year period of time of frequent collecting, the degraded site number really didn't change. And the idea that a prairie a high-quality prairie can succeed and move into a lower-quality site and improve its species richness just doesn't seem to be working out. What's more troublesome is that the high-quality prairie number is dropping. And we're not exactly certain why. We have some theories, but that too is an issue. So, myth or fact, ever-changing, dynamic, and resilient. We can proclaim that all prairies always look different, they always change, therefore they must be highly adaptable and dynamic. You can go there 20 years from now, certainly it's going to look different. Well, we feel that that's a myth. Those are assertions that are glibly pronounced despite the very explicit documentation that these prairies are rare. They're obliterated habitat on Earth, Doug Ladd and Nature Conservancy. And therefore, Prairie State Park research demonstrates that once these prairies have a history of damage, it's not easy to get them restored back, even in a 60-year period of time. They just don't readily come back. So the point is, when you damage a prairie through time, if you make a mistake in how you manage it, you lose species richness, it goes through a turnstile, and you're not going to come back very easily. So that renders high-quality prairies perhaps irreplaceable, the high-quality ones. The other myth is that we've all heard that an old field and or a prairie with change in climate succeeds to some different, higher quality natural community. It might go from a savanna to a woodland to even the deepest forest. The reality of it is there's not a single study in Missouri yet in the last 150 years of botanical study and research that has demonstrated that we have a part of our landscape that is succeeding to some different kind of ecosystem of equal or higher quality. They're all still just their degraded former selves. So this concept doesn't work very well. So we go back then to Niawathe and look at the possible consequences. We're right now asking questions about what's been observed on the ground. One of those things that Don Kerr saw at Niawathe was an increase in the amount of sumac that was occurring on the prairie. Doug Ladd and the Nature Conservancy has also expressed a concern about these woodies. There are other increasers like this old buckbrush that is indicative of overgrazing, and especially also in woodlands across the Ozarks. And then you have a couple of scattered exotics like multiflora rose that are out there. So these are alarming. Doug says of the Nature Conservancy, he's concerned about the proliferation of undesirable woody species, because what that tends to do is also further suppress in the soil these high-quality plants that occur around them. So also, if you were to look at this prairie, I did a little exercise here of just listing the species that I see in the photograph without doing sampling. So obviously it's just appearance then. Let's just not go by anything else other than appearance. And counting 12 plants that are in this scene, they have an index of 5.2. Now, if you look at Niawathe in 2009, these are the primary ones that I see in the photograph. When you tally and average up all these numbers, it drops to a 2.4 mean average. Well, that to me, just in appearance, is kind of an early indicator that something is amiss, and we ought to look at it closer. And I think that's what's alarmed so many of you, is seeing these differences. So these are all also recorded as grazing increaser plants. We also know that a prairie is made up of many different kinds of organisms in that complex food chain, and in that complex web, with complex molecular interactions both above and below ground. These are a list of all of the known species in Missouri, all the biodiversity. You can take a portion of these that are specifically found on prairies only. One in particular I want you to notice is the number of insects that occur in the state, many of which are prairie insects. So we have, not to mention tens of thousands of microbes. So again, you look at this environment, and the Conservancy expressed concern, and others. Well, if prairies are supposed to provide through a growing season a wide array of different flowering and seeding plants for insect life, invertebrates, and their connection to other life, where are they? Well, they're supposed to be here. You can see that there are some plants in flower, like this one back here, but that's boneset, a grazing increaser, but still relatively absent across most of the entire growing season, because the grazing's occurring for 3 to 4 months during the growing season. So if you had this, you can see the difference might be then, unlike, well, the difference between this and Niawathe is this is at Prairie State Park. Bison have grazed these plants, but they haven't grazed it down to a lawn. This isn't heavy grazing, it's occasional grazing, so it's different. And it's enough that those plants are able to send back up energy reserves and to flower. So those plants then might provide for insect life. And Arduzer, you're here? Is he here? No, okay. So he looks at bees. There are 21 species he recorded on prairie. Other really unusual insects, regal fritillary butterflies expressed concern about, and are these leaf beetles. So we have a total of 87,100 plus insects found in Missouri, of which a significant number might be found on a prairie. And a study was done showing that under different management regimes, 71 butterfly species on burned prairies, 53 on hay, but only 27 on grazed. So there's some differences there. And I would beg to differ that that number would change in this environment where there's not very much flowering. The other migration fact is that there's a concept, and this is on the Nature Conservancy website, that we're emulating by using cattle the patterns of historic grazing. If we look at the quotes by M.J. I can't pronounce Sajahan, I guess it's the name for the lead scientist in Nature Conservancy. When people think of great migrations, probably the greatest migration of all was bison on the North American Great Plains, perhaps as many as 60 million bison. You think about wildebeest, there might have only been 1.5 million animals. So the plains were considered like one giant African savanna, but the reality of it is that that's gone. And the loss of the greatest mammalian migration on Earth is a tragedy. It's a statement by him. So myth or fact, cattle when managed with patch-burn grazing can mimic bison foraging behavior. Well, if you start to examine and look at how bison actually interacted on a continental landscape without fences, it was thought that they migrated regularly throughout the Great Plains with herds of 60 million moving north and south in the fall, and returning when spring rains brought fresh grass to the northern part of the range. So they traveled more or less and spent the winter in areas to the south, 320 to 640 miles away from where they were in the summer. So even when you look at Mammals of Missouri, published by Charles Swartz, his account is that there are only vague numbers of bison, sporadic numbers in Missouri upon settlement, never common. That's all it says. There's not any more information than that, but that's a quote from him. So the question is, are we really emulating, during the summertime, during the growing season, what bison did? Keeping in mind that cattle are confined, bison never were. They could roam anywhere in the continent, be chased by wolves or predators, or chased off by storms or insects that are constantly on the move, but it was basically known that their grazing grounds were primarily in the northern part of the plains. So these are some of the historic grazing patterns, and you would ask the question, is what we're doing on our prairies truly mimicking what bison did historically? So this approach mimics our native grassland historic rhythms. It is done so with the belief it will improve exceptional for summer weight gains and better wildlife habitat. And this is what we've read in articles that you can go to on the conservation website, win-win for prairie chickens and ranchers, but not much discussion in there about biodiversity and what it's doing for everything else. Just a few things it's focused on. Managers then remove the cattle after 120 days. And as I learned today in a meeting that we had, the livestock can be grazed for 3 months, sometimes 4, for 3 years successively in a row, and then allowed to rest and recover after being heavily grazed. So we have concerns about those. This factor, biotic homogenization, it's difficult for people to actually accept today, and if you of you have heard me talk about biotic homogenization, Google it and you'll get 45,000 hits on Google of what it means. But basically, our whole North American continent, most all the flora, particularly in the eastern half of the United States, is rather than undergoing succession or a healing that has resulted from settlement, all of our flora is subject to a transformation and or a change that's being caused by many of these factors: exotic weed invasion, overhaying, burning, overgrazing, change in management style, mining, housing, construction. Everywhere we're seeing a conversion. Probably the greatest manifestation of that conversion is just right outside this building. Most of all of this area between here over to the Missouri and the Mississippi River and parts of the Merrimack was historically prairie upon settlement. And that's difficult for most people to see that today, but that's how it was described. This was a prairie landscape. Even around here, there was a blend between prairie and savanna. So we call this the planet of weeds, and now we got this homogenization process that we have to try to protect our prairies against. An example of that is, again, Niawathe Prairie, 240 acres, surrounded by all of this other agricultural land, plowed fields, croplands, exotics, old fields, few native pastures. And what that causes is that historically, fire used to spread across the entire highly diverse prairie landscape, and that fire would stimulate production of seed and our plant propagules that would migrate and move about. Problem is, we don't have fire migrating, moving about anymore. Wherever we're going to get our plant diversity is now, it's no longer going to come in to where, off the landscape around the high quality prairies, but it simply means that what we have on that prairie landscape is likely all the propagules of biodiversity and genetic diversity that there is going to be unless we bring something in. I love this quote from Swink and Wilhelm in 1994. In our contemporary fragmented landscapes, conserving native plants neither have refuge, effective migration routes, nor the time to adapt or move. This has profound consequences for managing natural areas. That is simply because genetic memory of ancient ecosystems do not readily adapt to abruptly different management styles or land use changes. So what makes this particularly challenging then in terms of looking at grazing management, which is an intensive and I believe again troublesome tool, is that you establish, like we did on Forest Service, contract times, which we don't like to tell a permittee that we want to change the contract because of what's happening to the prairie. We need to identify thresholds for too intensive grazing. Is the grass height, or is it just that you allow heavy grazing? Not easy telling the permittee to remove livestock early. Graze 3 years and burning different patches assumes it'd be okay regardless of what we think the consequences are. There's not a lot of trigger points that are discussed when we do these things that tell us very early on that we should change the way it's being managed. And is there monitoring in place? So as a consequence of that, we discovered on the U.S. Forest Service lands, once again, when we revisit the Mark Twain National Forest. Many of you have been to glades. You know what glades look like? Yeah, quite a few of you have. So in southwest Missouri, it is the heartland of the major glade region of the entire globe. We've established management prescriptions for ecosystem restoration on 448,000 acres. And in the plan, it specifically states close all areas that contain glade and woodlands when current permit expires. We've now closed everything, and it's about 10,000 acres. Primarily, partly because we found out that grazing management in itself is just complex and difficult. It's very troublesome to deal with. So you have managers then, and as we go through time, Jim Henry and I have gone through probably 4 or 5 directors of agencies, a number of governors, and many other people who have all different management styles or concepts or ideas, or they aspire to do different things when they're in charge of organizations. They reassemble them, they disband them, and so what happens then is when, for example, organizations become decentralized, managers might have their own idea what they want the landscape to be. The same prairie parcel can take on different appearances depending upon management style. And it can be either high quality, or it can be mismanaged, or it can have grazing increasers. It can be neglected, maybe eventually like this, and then finally like this, a degraded former prairie. All those styles, again, are philosophical and professional. So what has to happen is you have to have advocates of scientists and organizations like you to make sure that during those times of organizational change, that managers in the organization are held accountable. Okay, so where are we today? The Department of Conservation, when you look at the Leahy study, states it manages 13,000 acres of remnant unplowed prairie. In 2009, it deployed patch burn grazing on 11 prairie conservation areas, which represents 17% of those areas. And the current plans, at least as when this was published, for prairie chicken recovery was to have patch burn grazing used on 19 prairies. For 2010s, the plans were to utilize patch burn grazing on Taberville, all of Niawathe Natural Area, and part of Pawnee Prairie Natural Area. Well then, the environmental groups and other interest groups came along and they expressed concern. So where are we now? So in 2010, these are the prairie natural areas. This is the amount of grazing that went on. Niawathe at 320, Prairie State Park. I talked to Ken McCarty of Prairie State Park. He told me 2,000 acres is subject to bison and elk. Osage Prairie 50 and Pawnee 29, Taberville 312. Then if we look at today, we can see that has changed. Niawathe Prairie is not going to be grazed. No more grazing is proposed. But I wanted to add 2 prairies down here, Chapel View and Stony Point, because they were 2 that Don had acquired, Don Kurz. Those are on the list, on the Director Zemer list, to have some kind of grazing, and they're in the heritage database as being at least B quality prairies. So there are other high quality prairies that are subject to this. So in the January 21st, 2011, Robert Zemer, Director Zemer's letter, of which some of you in this room received that letter, it states they're going to defer indefinitely on TC prairie natural areas unless they consent. No new patch burn grazing on designated natural areas or other agency organization prairie areas without other justification. And they make an exception, Osage, due to ongoing research. So I wanted to tell you, the people in this room representing a lot of these interest groups that express concern, this is a major win to start with. You at least have postponed any further activity, any further proposals to graze, and we've deferred it or eliminated it all on Niawathe, the prairie of greatest concern. So that is a major win. It's a cautionary win, and we need to be vigilant, but that's a major win. The Nature Conservancy published and presented to the Missouri Natural Area System, we should be cautious about using grazing on natural areas to enhance viability or abate threats to system and component organisms. And what that means is that we should, on high quality prairies, what should come first is the diversity of the ecosystem, the complexity, and maintaining as a desire that complexity, not some other primary driver. And it's essential that management undertaken and what we have left documented as having no deleterious impacts, or already we've seen the alarm come up. And since once lost, these cannot be regained. They have stated that, and I feel that way too. So the Natural Areas Committee, this is another great progress, made its recommendation and a set of natural area management recommendations that they do not recommend using livestock grazing to all natural area managers until more data or impacts collected on non-natural area sites. We don't have the power as a committee to say you can't, but if they're being damaged, we can delist it as a natural area. But nevertheless, we can say to agencies, we don't recommend it. So, concluding then, 99% of Missouri's historic ancient prairie soil and its associated high-quality natural communities, they're destroyed. 99%, a profound number. And you could look at every other state. Imagine Iowa and Illinois and all corn. Same thing. Overgrazing, cropping, seeding with exotics are the most destructive forces having removed that former prairie natural community. We cannot deny that which we want to use as a tool was also responsible for destroying most of the prairie. Intensive monitoring, where we have it, shows that it's a myth to expect prairies are resilient and if damaged will recover. The reality of it is you need to set very explicit measurements for what it is you desire in terms of high quality prairie to be and to measure against those. That's what should drive your decisions. So 100 years of experimenting with stocking rates will likely cause irreversible damage. What we already heard as a group today, some of us in the discussion, was that perhaps at Niawathe Prairie, a miscalculation was made in how it was grazed. But the point is, if you think about the next 100 years of different people managing prairies and under different management styles, you can't afford many of those mistakes on the very few high-quality prairies we have left. My conclusion is the same as with the U.S. Forest Service. Remaining high-quality prairie patches are likely too small to experiment with patch burn grazing. That's my view. And with that, I'll leave for questions. How was I on time? Cool. Throw the tomatoes. Yes, Rex.
I had heard at one time remarks made about the possible delisting of Niawathe Prairie to natural area. Will the Natural Areas Committee, and do they have the ability or the capability to send out some monitoring efforts to establish whether Niawathe was permanently damaged, or where does that stand right now with the Natural Areas Committee?
With the Natural Areas Committee, there's been myself and Mike Leahy, who's on the committee, and Doug Ladd and others who have agreed to the idea of pulling together a monitoring group so that we can develop a monitoring strategy that we know in which the data is going to be collected the way it needs to be collected out at Niawathe, and then do an analysis of that data. The real challenge to Niawathe, as we found out today, is that on the highest quality parcels, there was no pre-data established on the highest quality tract that was grazed, so it's difficult to have a point of reference. Now there are other places, for example, where the Nature Conservancy has done monitoring intensively, and they've established those reference conditions in terms of numbers as well as being descriptive about what was out there, all the way down to rare and species of conservation concern. So that's going to be a real challenge at Niawathe. I think it's too early, a little premature, without having further assessments to say it shouldn't be a natural area. But certainly there are those on the committee then in due time that if we feel the area doesn't any longer qualify, we could recommend it be delisted. Oh, come on, more. I love questions. You all want to get out of here. Yes?
Question about the impact on folks that want to graze. You mentioned the Forest Service has moved grazing from blight areas, and that's, I know, in a different area of the state than we're talking here, but is there a, quote, need or demand
Well, we asked that question today, and we were told, no, that wasn't a primary driver. It was mostly biological, and the need was expressed to perhaps consider using this as a management tool to emulate a historic process that would especially benefit birds of concern. But it's not a driver as I understand it. Am I correct in that, Len? Yeah, I think Len was at a meeting today and he had mentioned that. So we didn't get a sense from what was talked about that was a primary issue. Now, certainly there might be a perception of that, because when you go to the website, and we talked about that too, that's always talked about, win-win for prairie chickens and ranchers and cattle gains and so forth. That sends a message, and it may not be the best message in terms of conserving prairies. Yes?
Yeah, one of the areas that I noticed was grandfather prairie, friendly prairie, have a heavy dose of cedar trees that have grown in there because they have not been allowed to burn. So there does appear to be some succession going on in many of these areas, which you kind of suggested doesn't happen. Are you suggesting that those prairies are actually more degraded than what they look like?
Well, when you think about cedar trees and perhaps other woody species, a cedar is an opportunistic, pioneering, invasive species. It's very adaptable, we've found, in all environments of the state, particularly where ecosystems have, particularly the structure and of a really rich former ecosystem has been damaged to the degree where it's left the ground barren sometime in past history. The cedar readily invades in those sites. The more damage, you can go southwest Missouri and find glades and old prairies and savannas that are choked in cedar trees when historically they weren't there at all. So that it's probably partly due to the damage that was done through some history and time. But that's the primary reason. Now, that particular instance, it might be a simple matter of going in and just selectively cutting down those trees and then assuring that occasionally it gets either prescribed burn and or occasionally some haying that's done to keep the woody vegetation down. Yes, Dave.
Looks like the prairie chicken has been one of the drivers of the use of this pasture grazing cattle on the prairies. Have the prairie chicken populations increased or, as a result of this grazing, or is there evidence that would lead us to believe that populations of prairie chickens are indeed going to increase now?
Well, if you read the website and some of the articles, they suggest that is occurring, but in part also it's to the success of reintroductions from, I think, either Canada and Nebraska. But I can't really answer, I'm not qualified to answer that question because I don't have the information. What I can tell you, I've talked to some people within the bird community who look at prairie chickens strategically on a national scale and a regional scale. And they think in the long term it's going to be very challenging and very difficult to try to sustain prairie chickens in Missouri's environment. It might be best left to trying to fight that battle where there are greater numbers of prairie chickens in the Great Plains. Okay. Yes. Sure, Carol.
If you Google Hatchburn grazing, you find a lot of discussion about it out west further in shortgrass prairie. Are you familiar with the dynamics in that environment? Is it problematic?
Well, what I can tell you from the research that I've read, primarily coming out of the University of Oklahoma and pioneered by a Dr. Samuel Fuhlendorf, and in fact had an opportunity to listen to him give a talk at the National Natural Areas Conference this past fall, is that Great Plains prairies, if you remember that image of all that being open range cattle grazed country, then having suffered a lot of attempts to put it into agriculture, particularly during the Industrial era, received a tremendous amount of grazing pressure to the extent that a lot of these studies are done on prairies that are much more damaged than even these big nets of Missouri prairies, these small little parcels of higher quality tracts. And so their problem is they don't have a reference point of a high-quality condition to move toward. All they're looking at is how that affects changes in things like species richness, which it could include weedy things, because there's no reference to conservative plants, and our structure. So from that standpoint, without having those references, you can certainly say the way that it's applied as a tool has different results, and for what we need, it's positive. But if it were, how does it affect a high-quality natural community, there are none of the studies that I've read that lend any information along those lines. Yes?
Your experience with the department, conservation department, what kind of further action do you think they're going to do? Do you think that they're going to still try to do grazing like at lesser amounts of cattle or in a short period of time?
Well, all I can refer to is the Director Zemer letter, and I don't know if anybody knows all the particulars of that, but it provides guidance on this issue since it's become so controversial. And it at least states that they're not going to expand patch-burn grazing on the higher quality prairie tracts and in natural areas. But I don't know to what extent that they might be looking at it as a tool elsewhere, unless you have some information on that. Yeah.
Right now, that's what they're.
Yeah, they're kind of holding in a holding pattern, wanting to gather more information, research. They're proposing a stakeholder meeting with interest groups to get further input. So we're, at least as we did today, we had a meeting with members of the Department of Conservation, including one of the managers here tonight, and it was a pretty congenial, formal meeting. We had a lot of exchange. We threw 20 questions and more at them on this subject, so they got hammered pretty well, but we all agreed that in an initial stage of having these discussions, there are going to be debates, there will be differences of opinion, sometimes tempers flare, but that's an important part of just this process of gathering information, better understanding the issues, so that eventually we can figure out the right path to take. And I think that's kind of where they're at. Yes? I'm sorry, could you speak up a little more, sir?
Is there any evidence of any bison grazing contact there with cattle?
Oh, we had a lot of discussion about that today. There are differences. There are studies that show that, particularly in different parts of the country, depending on how studies are set up, there are differences in the way they graze, at the timing, the duration, the patterns, what they prefer, and that in part, that was part of the discussion and some of the argument. But to be quite honest with you, if bison are not managed correctly as a tool because they're now in confinement, like at Prairie State Park, they can be a problem too. And in fact, there are concerns at Prairie State Park about the possibility that there are just too many bison, and because they're in confinement, they have no way to migrate around, even though they're employing patch-burn grazing at the state park. And the state park system, for those who don't know, is managed by the Department of Natural Resources, so that's different than conservation, to be fair. And again, you're looking at a person who was instrumental in bringing the bison there, so I'm concerned about it equally as well. So a bigger issue is, how is the tool even being used? It'd be great if everyone could bring just bison, like the Nature Conservancy is going to do it on Pawnee Prairie, and we did Prairie State Park in 1984, but it comes with a tremendous amount of operational responsibility and a lot of challenges. If you've ever been into a holding pen with bison, trying to corral them, and seen something that weighs like a small pickup truck bouncing around and wanting to get a piece of you, it's sometimes a little different than just cattle. It's very intimidating. So it's scary. I have a question over here.
I was going to ask something about bison too. How about the size of the prairie? How large or small? How does that relate to the patch-burn grazing?
Yeah. Well, I think what we discovered when we went to Niawathe Prairie and looked at it is that the idea with the patch-burn grazing there was to divide 240 acres into thirds and do a prescribed burn here and expect the cattle to graze heavily down there, and then a burn here and then a burn here, and expect the cattle to move to where the forage came up in the burns. But the reality of it there is that there were so many livestock for such a long time, they grazed everything very hard. Now, likewise, again, at Prairie State Park, they use patch burn grazing there. But the same concern there on a 700-acre grazing allotment, which right now I understand is the largest grazing allotment in the state, and they have bison on that grazing allotment, is that still, even though you might do a patch burn over in one segment of the prairie, it doesn't matter the season, those bison still are going to go through the whole prairie, even though they might spend more time over here, and sniff out all the plants. Their noses can find what we call the ice cream plants. And even though it may look subtle to an ecologist, you may not see it, if you study it close enough on the ground, you'll find that some of those plants begin to disappear, even in a patch burn environment. Now, Dr. Samuel Fuhlendorf gave a presentation on this in which he looked at an allotment out in Oklahoma that was 24,000 acres in size. And he did radial collaring of the cattle on that 24,000 acre allotment, and we're talking about 6 or 7 miles across to the other end, and they were able to look at satellite where those cattle were going, and what it revealed is that regardless of the patch burn, the cattle went everywhere. So he said 24,000 acres is really kind of too small to truly emulate what happened on a continental scale. You know, so this problem of size is also very troublesome. And the smaller you get, the more likely the animals are to visit everywhere on the prairie, regardless of what you do, unless you're very careful about the timing and watching them, which is why I think it's still better to manage your own herd. And to know that when they seem to have done enough grazing on one patch and they start going elsewhere, get them off, rather than, well, I said with the permittee, I've got to go 4 months, so that's what I've got to do. And no matter what the consequences, that's what will happen. That's what the Forest Service was doing. We never have in the history had anyone, any grazing manager in the Forest Service say on the Mark Twain, I think your cattle are causing a problem, you need to take them off now. They just waited until the permit expired and or the season for the grazing, because it's an inconvenience. That's the part that I say is troublesome. Good question. Yes?
Okay, so, I mean, obviously, heavy grazing is, destroy everything. How about light grazing? What is, just one cow?
Well, it's kind of a trick. I mean, who are you going to get to manage one cow on a prairie? You know. I think probably the best way to do that is, I know that our grazing specialist who worked out west in big grazing allotments named Brian Davidson now works for the Mark Twain out of our office, and he's gone out to Prairie State Park with Allison. And he contends probably the best scenario is to have a landowner who has a gate right there next to the park, and you say, I'll let you run your animals out here for a week, then take them off, let everything recover, and have that kind of relationship. And that's what he contends. And our Prairie State Park, he told us, your bison shouldn't be out there for that long a period of time in confinement, year after year after year, through the growing season, through the entire year. And you have too many. It's not as much an issue of what is the right number as to whether, again, you're emulating presence, absence, as it occurred historically. And you got to remember, we don't have a continental scale landscape anymore. We're down to really tiny parcels of land that have good quality prairie left on them, so that makes this especially difficult. So I can't give you a number. What I am more interested in is, as I've talked about under the grazing management section of the terrestrial book, is for people to know that those plants and how they were adapted to a disturbance process. Prairie plants, these long-lived perennials, were clipped a number of times. And it's just sort of like mowing a lawn. If you put a plant out there of like having a garden plant, you clip it enough, those plants are sensitive and they're probably not going to come back. How far do you go with prairie plants in terms of how often they're clipped before they disappear? And you have to know that. You have to know certain species that are most sensitive and what's happening to them, rather than, well, we'll allow enough animals out there for 4 months no matter what the consequence, and if they mow it down to 4 inches, that's fine. It will, as I heard, heavy graze tracts recover. Well, that's what was practiced on Forest Service lands for grazing permitting started on U.S. forest land, I read, in 1935. It's a long time. And when we permitted grazing on open range, it was in woodlands as well as glades. And it didn't include just cattle, it included hogs and sheep and goats. So, and that's because that was initially the way the Forest Service had to try to get along with the local adjacent landowners who were grazing open range everywhere with everything. You know, and so that is very much a challenge to deal with that. Well, on our lands, you go out with the grazing managers, and it was, well, my book says down to 8 inches. And when you say that and you've had the cattle out there for 60 years in a row, you can really pretty well bet that the most sensitive plants, the ones they're seeking out first, are gone, or else the disturbance to the soil was such that they disappeared. And in fact, that's what Doug Ladd determined when the Conservancy went down and looked at the glades and did an assessment, is that so much damage was done, they were in shock. And we said, well, we just got to get the livestock off. You know, and that's what Tim Smith, who works for the Department of Conservation, he's now the ombudsman, and he was the state botanist. Well, he did the natural features inventory for those counties in southwest Missouri, and he said the same thing. They're all overgrazed. Nothing qualifies as a natural area. They've been damaged. And so that's really a tough one to take for a globally significant ecosystem complex. One other question I saw, yes? Well, I think that varies now, and it depends on the agency or the organization. I know that the Department of Natural Resources did some research and initially did some small experimentation on patches of prairies that were burned at different times of the year. And again, they collected data on saying, well, one time of the year is good for grasses and forbs, or grasses another time of the year might be good for forbs. Here's the effect or impact it had on birds and insects, so on. But it really gets down to trying to describe and define what it is you desire in terms of a really healthy prairie complex in this range of disturbance regimes and emulating that. We had a fire in the middle of August at Prairie State Park. Well, I'd have to ask Lynn.
Well, the cattle burn in the spring, but it can be burned in the fall, but you get different effects from the response from the cattle, whether it's burned in the fall or in the spring.
Yeah. So that's kind of a part of another challenge and an issue is when you do your prescribed burn, are we thinking about using the fire in a way that will benefit the entire health of the ecosystem, or is it what the cattle do? And there's still a lot of questions about that aspect of it. We're behind on, or we're out of time, and but you're not worried about that. If some of you need to leave, feel free to leave. If others have questions, I'll stick around for a bit. Otherwise, thank you all. Appreciate it.